You already know what it feels like, not the dramatic version, not the collapse, not the breakdown people describe in memoirs. The quieter one, the one that happens on an ordinary morning when your alarm goes off and, before you've even opened your eyes, you feel it, a weight sitting on your chest. Not pain exactly, more like the accumulated pressure of everything unresolved, everything half-finished, everything you said yes to when you meant no, everything you kept because releasing it felt like a kind of dying. You lie there and you think, I haven't even started the day yet. That feeling has a name, not in medicine, not officially. But cognitive scientists have been circling it for decades, describing what happens when a mind carries more open loops than it can quietly manage. William James, the father of American psychology, wrote about consciousness as a stream, not a container. The image matters. A stream moves, it clears. But when you drop enough debris into it, unresolved relationships, accumulated guilt, commitments made out of fear rather than desire, it stops moving. It pools. It stagnates. And a stagnant stream doesn't look broken from the outside. It just stops going anywhere. That's not burnout. Burnout is the dramatic end stage. What most people are living is something earlier and quieter. Clutter load. The measurable cognitive cost of everything you haven't yet decided about, released, organized, or made automatic. Research in cognitive psychology calls it attentional residue, the way unfinished business continues to occupy working memory long after you've physically walked away from it. You're at dinner with someone you love, and part of your mind is still in that conversation. From 3 weeks ago, you never properly finished. You're trying to sleep, and the background hum of 17 unmade decisions runs like a program you forgot to close. You are not tired from today. You are tired from everything you are still carrying from before today. This is a book about 5 Japanese principles that have existed in manufacturing philosophy for decades and have almost nothing to do with manufacturing. They were built to bring order to complex, high-stakes systems. And a human life, your life, is the most complex, highest-stakes system you will ever be responsible for. The 5 principles are Seiri, Saiten, Seiso, Seiketsu, and Shitsuke. Sort, set in order, shine, standardize, sustain. The words are simple enough to dismiss. Don't, because what lies inside them, when you press past the surface, is a complete philosophy of how a person becomes someone who can carry difficulty without being crushed by it. How discipline stops being a demand made on you from outside and becomes an expression of who you actually are from inside. We will move through these principles slowly, honestly, and without the usual promises. No claim that transformation takes 21 days. No suggestion that the right system will make hard things easy. What these principles offer is more useful than that. Structure strong enough to hold you when you're not strong enough to hold yourself. The first step is always the hardest. Not because it requires the most effort, but because it requires the most honesty. Let's begin. Before we go deeper, take a quick second to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I always find it amazing how people from different parts of the world connect through these messages. Chapter 1. The weight you don't feel anymore. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that doesn't show up in blood tests. Your iron is fine. Your thyroid is normal. The doctor nods and says you're healthy, and you sit in the parking lot afterwards thinking, then why does everything feel like this? The answer, more often than not, isn't in your body. It's in what you're carrying. And the more insidious problem isn't the weight itself. It's that you've stopped feeling it. Not because it got lighter, because you got used to it. This is what psychologists call hedonic adaptation. the brain's remarkable, and in this case deeply inconvenient, ability to normalize almost anything over time. It evolved for survival. The same mechanism that helps trauma survivors function also quietly convinces you that the friendship draining you is just how friendships feel, that the low-grade dread you wake up with is just your personality, that the life slowly narrowing around you is simply what adult life is. You stop noticing the weight because the weight became the baseline. SARI, the first of the 5S principles, is the deliberate, uncomfortable act of noticing again. The word is often translated as sort, which is accurate and almost entirely misleading because it makes you think of closets. Of those weekend projects where you pull everything out, feel briefly virtuous, and put 70% of it back because deciding is harder than you expected. That is not SARI. SARI is discernment. It is the practice of looking at every element of your life, every commitment, every relationship, every habit, every belief you carry about yourself, and asking with genuine honesty, does this belong here, or am I just used to it? The distinction between belongs here and am I just used to it is the whole game. Daniel Kahneman spent decades mapping the architecture of human judgment, and one of his most important findings is that the mind operates on two systems. System 1 is fast, automatic, and largely unconscious. It runs the background processes, makes the rapid associations, handles the familiar. System 2 is slow, deliberate, and effortful. It's what engages when you're doing something genuinely new or genuinely difficult. The problem with accumulated clutter is that it migrates entirely into System 1. It becomes background. The draining friendship, the job that stopped fitting you 3 years ago, the story you tell yourself about why you can't, all of it runs on autopilot, beneath the level of conscious evaluation, costing you constantly in ways you cannot see because you are no longer looking. SARI forces a System 2 audit. It drags what has become automatic back into conscious scrutiny and asks, did I choose this, or did I just stop choosing against it? There is a brutality to this question. Don't soften it, because here is what the sorting process reveals, almost universally, when people do it honestly. The majority of what they're carrying was never consciously chosen. It accumulated. The obligation that started as a favor. The habit that started as a coping mechanism during a hard year and stayed long after the hard year ended. The self-image assembled from other people's opinions during a period of life when you were not yet equipped to evaluate those opinions. You didn't decide to carry these things. You simply never decided to put them down. Roy Baumeister's research on ego depletion showed something that should disturb you. Willpower, decision-making capacity, emotional regulation. These are not infinite resources. They deplete across the day like a battery draining. Every choice you make, every impulse you resist, every emotional response you manage draws from the same finite pool. Now consider what happens when your life is full of things that require constant low-level management. The resentment you're suppressing towards someone you haven't addressed, the guilt you're carrying about something you cannot change, the decision you've been postponing for 6 months. Each of these is not a static weight. Each is an active drain, a program running in the background, consuming processing power you could be using for the things that actually matter to you. This is the hidden cost of an unsorted life. Not just that it feels heavy, but that it quietly consumes the resources you would otherwise spend on the people you love, the work that matters to you, the version of yourself you're trying to become. And then there's what Bluma Zeigarnik discovered in a Berlin restaurant in the 1920s, noticing that waiters could recall every detail of an unpaid bill but forgot completed orders almost immediately. Her subsequent research confirmed what she'd observed. The mind keeps unfinished business in an active, accessible state, returning to it repeatedly, involuntarily, as if checking whether it's been resolved yet. Every open emotional loop in your life is doing this. The conversation you never had, the apology you never received, the decision you made but never fully accepted. Your mind is cycling back to all of them, quietly, continuously, even when you believe you've moved on. The Zeigarnik effect doesn't care what you believe. It cares what's unresolved. Siri is, in part, the practice of closing loops, not always by resolving them, some things cannot be resolved, but by making a conscious decision about them. The decision itself is what closes the loop. I am releasing this, I am keeping this, I am addressing this. The mind can file a decision. What it cannot file is perpetual ambiguity. Here is the part that surprises people when they actually do the sorting. Most of what they're carrying is not precious. When you pull it out of the background and look at it directly, the guilt over something that happened 6 years ago and cannot be changed, the opinion of someone who hasn't thought about you in years, the commitment made to avoid an awkward conversation, it loses its authority almost immediately. It was powerful in the dark. Examined in full light, it's just old weight with no current purpose. Not everything, of course. Some of what you're carrying deserves to be carried. Some relationships, though difficult, are genuinely worth the cost. Some commitments, though heavy, are expressions of your deepest values. Siri is not minimalism as ideology. It is not the instruction to want less, or live with less, or perform simplicity. It is the instruction to choose consciously, to know what you're carrying and why you're carrying it, rather than bearing weight you've simply never examined. The sorting process begins with a single, quiet, honest question asked of every relationship, every habit, every commitment, every story you tell about yourself. Is this genuinely mine, or did I just stop questioning it? Ask it slowly. Ask it without defensiveness. Ask it about the things you're most reluctant to examine, because those are almost always the ones costing you the most. What you discover on the other side of that question is not emptiness. It's space. And space, it turns out, is not the absence of something. It's the condition required for anything real to grow. Chapter 2. The Taxonomy of Clutter. Most people, when they hear the word clutter, picture a room, stacked magazines, closets that won't close, the chair in the bedroom that becomes a textile archaeology site, layer by layer, season by season. And yes, physical clutter is real, and its psychological cost is measurable. Researchers at UCLA found that cortisol levels in women rose in direct proportion to the density of objects in their homes. Stress hormones, from stuff. The body registers disorder even when the conscious mind has learned to look past it. But physical clutter is the least of it. It's the visible symptom of something operating at a much deeper level. There are 4 categories of clutter that a human life accumulates. Most people manage 1 or 2 of them on good years. Almost nobody addresses all 4 simultaneously. And because they feed each other, each category of unexamined weight, making the others harder to see, dealing with only 1 or 2 creates the strange experience of having organized your desk and still feeling like your life is full of noise. The 4 categories are physical, relational, emotional, and cognitive. They are not equal in weight, and they are not equal in difficulty. But they share one characteristic. Left unexamined, they all draw from the same finite account. Physical clutter is the entry point, the easiest to see, the most socially acceptable to address, and the one that creates the least internal resistance. You can sort your kitchen without confronting anything about yourself. This is both its value and its limitation. The value, it is a practice run for the harder categories. The act of physically sorting, handling each object, making a decision, committing to placement, trains the sorting muscle before it has to lift anything heavy. The limitation, people often stop here, mistake the cleared countertop for the cleared life, and wonder why they still feel the same. Relational clutter is the second category, and it is where most people begin to feel genuine resistance. Because relationships, even the ones that are costing you significantly, come with history, with shared experience, with the complicated loyalty that forms between people who have witnessed each other's difficult years. Releasing a relationship, or even honestly reevaluating one, feels like a betrayal of that history, as if the past is only valid if the present continues. It isn't. The past was real. The history stands. A relationship can have mattered enormously and still be over, not because someone failed, but because people change, and some connections belong to a version of you that no longer fully exists. Holding on to them out of loyalty to who you used to be is not fidelity. It's a refusal to grow. What makes relational clutter particularly costly is what Baumeister's ego depletion research reveals about the mechanism of drain. Every relationship that exists in a state of unresolved tension, where you're managing your responses, suppressing your actual feelings, performing a version of yourself that fits the relationship's expectations, requires active, continuous regulation. You are not passively tolerating it. You are working, invisibly, exhaustingly, every time you're in proximity to that person and every time they occupy your thoughts, which for a close relationship is constantly. The relational clutter in your life is not sitting still while you're not looking. It's running. The third category is emotional clutter, and this is where the taxonomy gets genuinely uncomfortable. Emotional clutter is everything you're still carrying from experiences that have technically ended, guilt about decisions made under circumstances that no longer exist, shame about versions of yourself assembled before you had better information, grief that was never fully felt and therefore never fully moved through, anger maintained toward people who have no idea they're still being tried in the court of your private mind. Emotional clutter is the most exhausting category because it requires the most sophisticated management. Physical clutter just sits there. Relational clutter, at least, has an external cause you can point to. Emotional clutter is entirely internal. You are both the one carrying it and the one insisting it must be carried, usually without fully realizing you're making that insistence. The Zeigarnik effect operates with particular force here. The mind treats unprocessed emotional experience as an open file, something that hasn't been completed, hasn't been assigned meaning, hasn't been filed away, so it keeps retrieving it. A conversation from 7 years ago surfaces while you're in the shower. A failure from a previous chapter of your life intrudes on a moment that has nothing to do with it. You are not broken. You are not weak. Your mind is doing exactly what it evolved to do, persistently flagging unfinished business until it receives a resolution signal. The resolution signal, it turns out, is not forgetting. It is not getting over it. It is meaning-making, the conscious act of deciding what an experience means about you, about others, about the world, and then filing that interpretation as complete. This is what therapy does, at its best. This is what honest journaling does. This is what certain conversations do, the ones that leave you feeling lighter rather than raw, because something was actually completed rather than just revisited. The fourth category is cognitive clutter, and it is in some ways the most modern affliction. Cognitive clutter is the accumulation of unmade decisions, uncommitted positions, and perpetual optionality. The peculiarly contemporary problem of living in a state of so many open possibilities that you've effectively decided nothing. The email you've read 4 times without responding to. The project you haven't started or officially abandoned. The direction you keep almost committing to and then retreating from. Each of these occupies space in working memory, not proportional to its actual importance, but proportional to its unresolvedness. Barry Schwartz documented in his research on the paradox of choice that beyond a certain threshold, more options produce not more satisfaction, but more anxiety, more second-guessing, and less commitment to any single path. Cognitive clutter is the internal version of this. A mind so full of competing possibilities, half-formed plans, and postponed decisions that genuine focus becomes structurally impossible. You cannot think clearly about the important things because the unimportant, unresolved things are occupying the same cognitive real estate. Here is what all four categories share and why addressing only one or two is insufficient. They all drain from the same account. Baumeister's research didn't distinguish between emotional regulation, physical decision-making, and cognitive effort. They share a resource, which means that carrying unexamined relational clutter makes it harder to think clearly about your work. Carrying unprocessed emotional weight makes it harder to show up fully in your relationships. Carrying cognitive clutter makes it harder to access emotional presence. They are not separate problems. They are different manifestations of the same overdrawn account. Sayuri, genuinely practiced, addresses all four simultaneously, not because it is a magic system, but because it is the same question applied across every domain. Does this belong here? Asked of the chair with too many clothes on it, and the friendship that no longer runs in both directions, and the guilt about a choice made under circumstances you no longer inhabit, and the 17 tabs open in your mind, representing 17 things you haven't yet decided. The same question, the same honest scrutiny, the same willingness to make a decision and mean it. There is one more thing worth naming here before we move forward. The sorting process will feel at various points like loss, like you're being asked to make yourself smaller, to give things up, to become in some way less than you were. This feeling is a lie, a sophisticated and emotionally convincing lie, but a lie nonetheless. What you are losing is weight. What you are gaining is the capacity to actually move. A river without debris doesn't have less water. It has the same water finally able to go somewhere. Chapter 3. The Courage to Release. Here is something the sorting literature never quite says directly. Knowing what to release and actually releasing it are two entirely different cognitive events separated by something that feels, from the inside, almost exactly like grief. You can make the list. You can identify clearly with complete honesty that a particular relationship is costing more than it's returning, that a particular habit is a relic from a harder year, that a particular story you tell about yourself was written by someone who didn't know you well and didn't mean you well. You can know all of this with absolute clarity and still not let go. This is not weakness. This is not failure of will. This is the endowment effect, one of the most robust and replicated findings in behavioral economics, documented by Daniel Kahneman and Richard Thaler across dozens of studies. The endowment effect is the mind's systematic tendency to overvalue what it already possesses, simply because it already possesses it. In the original experiments, people demanded roughly twice as much to give up an object they'd been given as they were willing to pay to acquire the same object. Ownership itself inflates perceived value, independent of any rational assessment. Now apply this not to coffee mugs in a laboratory, but to identities. To the story of yourself as someone who has been treated unfairly. To the self-concept of someone who struggles with discipline, with relationships, with money. A self-concept that has been with you long enough to feel like a fact about you rather than a story you've been telling. To the grief you're still carrying about someone who is gone, which by now is not only grief, but also the last remaining thread of connection to them. So releasing the grief feels like losing the person a second time. The endowment effect doesn't distinguish between coffee mugs and identities. It applies the same inflation to both. And this is why people who genuinely understand what they need to release still cannot release it. Not because they lack insight, but because insight alone doesn't override the mechanism. What does? The Stoics understood something about this that the behavioral economists arrived at much later from a different direction. Epictetus, who was born into slavery and so had particular authority on the subject of what you can and cannot control, taught a practice he called prosoch, precise, unflinching attention to what is actually within your power and what is not. Not as resignation, as liberation. The Stoic argument is not that nothing matters, but that clinging to what you cannot control, including the past, including other people's behavior, including the version of yourself you used to be, is not loyalty or love or principle. It is a category error. You are applying effort to a domain where effort produces nothing except the continued experience of applying effort. Marcus Aurelius, in private notes never intended for publication, returned to this again and again. The discipline of releasing what is not yours to hold. He was emperor of Rome, and he wrote in his journal alone about the practice of letting things go. Not grandly, not dramatically, but quietly, repeatedly, as a daily exercise. Which tells you something important. This is not a problem that gets solved once. It is a practice engaged with continuously by even the most disciplined minds that have ever existed. But here is what the Stoics added that Kahneman didn't, and it is the insight that actually creates movement when insight alone won't. Releasing something is not a subtraction. It is the first act of self-definition. When you choose to put something down, deliberately, consciously, with full awareness that you are choosing, you are not diminishing yourself. You are asserting authorship. You are declaring that your life is composed of choices rather than accumulated circumstances. The act of release is, paradoxically, the first moment of genuine possession, because now you are carrying only what you have decided to carry. Amor fati, love of fate, is usually framed as the Stoic instruction to embrace what happens to you. But there is a subtler reading. The Latin amor does not mean passive acceptance. It means active preference. To practice amor fati in the context of release is to actively prefer reality over the comfortable fiction that holding on is the same as honoring something. It is not. Holding on past the point of usefulness is not love. It is refusal to accept that time moves, that people change, that you are allowed to become someone different from who you were. There is also a neurological dimension here that tends to be underappreciated. The brain's default mode network, the set of regions active during self-referential thought, during the construction of personal narrative, is highly conservative. It prefers consistency. It interprets change to self-concept as a mild threat, activating the same neural circuits involved in physical pain. This is not metaphor. Researchers at the University of Michigan found that social pain, rejection, loss, the dissolution of a significant relationship, activates the same regions as physical pain. The brain does not meaningfully distinguish between them, which means that the discomfort of releasing is not psychological weakness. It is literally painful, neurologically, in a way that is real and measurable. Knowing this doesn't make it stop hurting, but it changes the interpretation. You are not failing to be strong enough. You are doing something the brain registers as injury and choosing to proceed anyway. That is, by any honest definition, courage. The releasing process itself has a texture worth describing, because most accounts skip from the decision to the aftermath and leave out the middle, which is the part people actually need to navigate. The middle feels like standing in a doorway, not quite in the old room, not quite through to the next one. There is a period of genuine disorientation when you have decided to release something significant, but the release hasn't yet been metabolized. The old weight is gone, and the new spaciousness hasn't yet filled with anything. This period is not emptiness. It is the pause between exhalation and inhalation. It is necessary. It is not a sign that you've made a mistake. What fills it eventually is not replacement. This is important. The instinct, when you release something that has occupied significant space in your life, is to immediately fill the vacancy. A new relationship to replace the one released. A new project to replace the one abandoned. A new story to replace the one surrendered. Resist this. The space itself has value. In Japanese aesthetics, mie, negative space, purposeful emptiness, is not absence. It is a compositional element as active as anything that surrounds it. The pause in music is not silence. It is part of the music. The space created by releasing is not void. It is potential, resting before it becomes anything specific. Let it rest. Don't rush to fill it. One practical process for the releasing act, completable entirely in real time as you listen. Bring to mind one thing you know you're carrying that no longer belongs to you. Not the hardest thing. Not yet. One thing you've known for some time has passed its usefulness, but that you've kept anyway. Hold it in attention, not with analysis, not with the story of why it happened, or who was responsible, or what it meant. Just the thing itself as it is now, in the present, separated from its history. Then ask yourself, clearly and without dramatics, if I were building my life from scratch today, with everything I now know, would I choose to carry this? If the answer is no, and you already know what the answer is, then the release is not a decision you need to make. It is a decision you've already made that you're simply now permitting yourself to act on. The courage was never in the releasing. The courage was in admitting finally that you'd already decided. Everything after that is just putting something down. Chapter 4. Giving Things Their Place. Seitan. Imagine you've sorted. You've done the hard, honest work of the first principle. Pulled everything into the light, examined it without flinching, released what didn't belong, kept what did. Your life, at least in theory, now contains only what you've chosen. This should feel like freedom. And it does, for a while. Then something quieter sets in, a kind of low-grade friction that's harder to name than the old clutter because it's subtler. You have the right things. You just can't find them when you need them. The relationship you kept is real and good, but you never quite show up fully in it because you haven't decided what it actually is to you. The priority you identified matters genuinely, but it keeps losing to things that feel urgent in the moment and mean nothing in retrospect. You have sorted beautifully. But nothing has a home. This is what Seitan addresses. And Seitan is where most organizational thinking stops being about objects and starts being about the structure of a life. The word translates as set in order, which again sounds like a weekend project. Rearrange the pantry, label the shelves. But the philosophy underneath it is something the ancient Japanese aesthetics tradition understood, and modern behavioral science has only recently been able to explain mechanically. We do not do what we value. We do what is near. The arrangement of our environment, physical, temporal, relational, determines our behavior far more powerfully than our intentions do, far more reliably than our motivation does, far more consistently than our character does on any given day. B.J. Fogg at Stanford spent years building what he calls the Tiny Habits Framework, and the central insight, stripped of the packaging, is this. Behavior is a function of motivation, ability, and prompt. And of these three, ability, which includes proximity, ease, and accessibility is the most manipulable variable. You cannot reliably manufacture motivation. You cannot always create the perfect prompt, but you can almost always reduce friction. You can make the thing you want to do easier to do than the thing you don't. This is Seitan at its mechanical root. But there is a philosophical dimension to it that Fogg's framework doesn't quite reach. In traditional Japanese spatial design, there is a concept called ema, often translated as negative space or interval, but inadequately so in both cases. Ma is not the absence of something. It is the purposeful, considered emptiness between things that gives each thing its definition, its meaning, its ability to be what it is. In architecture, ema is the space between columns that makes each column distinct. In music, mea is the silence between notes that makes each note audible. In conversation, mea is the pause that allows a thought to land rather than collide with the next thought. In a life, ma is the space between commitments, between relationships, between priorities, that allows each one to be fully inhabited rather than blurred into the general noise. A life without ma is a life where everything competes at the same volume, where the urgent and the important are indistinguishable, where you move from one thing to the next without ever fully arriving anywhere. Seitan is not just about placing things. It is about creating ma, the purposeful spacing between things that allows each to be what it actually is. The practical question Seitan asks of every element of your life is not just, where does this go, but how far from the center of my life should this live? Think of it as concentric circles. At the center, the things you need access to constantly, the relationships and practices and priorities that are the load-bearing structures of the life you're building. They need to be close, reachable without effort. The friction of accessing them should be as close to zero as possible, because you will need them on your worst days as well as your best, and on your worst days you have no reserves to spend on effort. In the next ring out, things that matter regularly but not constantly, the creative practice you engage with weekly, the friendships that sustain you but don't require daily attention, the professional development that moves your work forward but isn't on fire today. These deserve a designated place, not shoved in a corner, not buried under urgent noise, but accessible without being in your face. In the outer ring, things that have value but low frequency. They exist, they belong in the inventory. But they should not occupy prime cognitive real estate. They should not be the first things your attention lands on when you're trying to think about what matters. Most people are living with this order inverted. The outer ring is at the center, the low-stakes, urgent demands absorbing the most attention, the most energy, the most time. The actual center, the relationships, the work, the practices that constitute a meaningful life, is pushed to the periphery, attended to in the leftover moments, which is to say, almost never. Seitan is the act of restoring the correct order, not as a metaphor. Physically, temporally, and in terms of where you direct your attention each day. Roy Baumeister and John Tierney's research on decision fatigue revealed something that should change how you design every morning of your life. The quality of decisions degrades across the day as cognitive resources deplete. Early in the day, you're at maximum capacity for complex judgment, creative thought, and resistance to temptation. By evening, you're making choices on fumes. This is not a character flaw. It is a neurological reality, consistent across populations, confirmed across dozens of studies, which means the order in which you encounter things across a day is not neutral. It is determinative. If your most important work, the work that requires your fullest self, is scheduled for afternoon, after hours of meetings and email and small decisions, you are systematically ensuring it receives the worst version of you. If your most important relationships receive attention only after the day has taken everything else, you are giving the people who matter most what's left, when mattering less has taken the rest. Seitan applied to time means scheduling your priorities as if they were appointments you cannot miss, not because someone else is expecting you, but because the future version of you is depending on the current version to show up. It means protecting the hours of maximum capacity for the work of maximum importance. It means designing your days so that what matters most is structurally first, not motivationally first, because motivation is weather. Structure is architecture. There is one more dimension of Seitan that most people resist most strongly, the ordering of priorities within relationships. Not the ranking of people, that is a different and crueler project, but the honest identification of what each relationship is actually for, what it genuinely provides, what it asks of you, and whether those two things are in reasonable proportion. A relationship without this clarity is not more loving for its lack of definition. It is more easily distorted, more easily exploited, more easily allowed to expand beyond what it should occupy until it is everywhere, and therefore nowhere in particular. Giving a relationship its proper place does not diminish it. It gives it a shape, and things with a clear shape can be fully inhabited. Things without a shape leak into everything, and you end up giving a little bit of yourself to everything and all of yourself to nothing. Here is what Seitan ultimately teaches, stated plainly without the vocabulary of systems thinking. The life you live is not primarily determined by what you value. It is determined by what you have made easy. Make the right things easy. Make the important things near. Give your priorities structural homes that don't require you to remember or decide or muster motivation every single time. Because someday, and that day always comes sooner than expected, you will be running on empty. And on that day, the only things you will do are the things you have made structurally easy to do. Design for that day now, while you still have the resources to design well. Chapter 5. The Architecture of Your Day. There is a version of your day that exists before you live it. A structure, implicit or explicit, that determines which version of you shows up for which demands, in which order, with what resources remaining. Most people have never consciously designed this structure. They have inherited it from employers, from social expectations, from the path of least resistance accumulated over years of responding to whatever arrived most urgently. Their day has a shape, but they didn't choose it. And because they didn't choose it, it serves everything except what matters most to them. Seitan applied to time is not scheduling. Scheduling is logistics. This is something closer to architecture, the deliberate design of a temporal environment that makes your most important work structurally possible rather than perpetually aspirational. The difference is significant. Aspirational thinking says, I should write more, exercise consistently, spend real time with the people I love. Architectural thinking says, at what hour, preceded by what, followed by what, with what conditions present, does this actually happen? Aspirational thinking produces good intentions. Architectural thinking produces a Tuesday that looks different from the Tuesday before it. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi spent decades studying what he called flow, the state of complete absorption in a challenging, meaningful task, characterized by effortless concentration, loss of self-consciousness, and a distorted sense of time passing. His research, drawn from thousands of experience sampling studies across different cultures and professions, produced findings that directly contradict one of the most persistent myths of creative and intellectual work: that the best conditions for deep thinking are unstructured, spontaneous, free-form. They are not. Flow states, Csikszentmihalyi found, are most reliably produced by a specific combination of conditions: clear goals, immediate feedback, and a task matched in difficulty to the outer edge of current skill. What this requires structurally is a protected environment, one where the task can develop its own momentum without interruption, without the attention being pulled to lower stakes demands, without the intrusion of the urgent into the domain of the important. Flow is not spontaneous. It is prepared for. The conditions that allow it must be arranged in advance by a self that is thinking architecturally rather than reactively. This is why the romantic image of the artist waiting for inspiration is, empirically, backwards. The artists and thinkers and scientists who produce the most significant work are overwhelmingly those with the most disciplined routines, not because discipline is aesthetically appealing, but because the brain needs a reliable signal that now is the time for deep work. Anthony Trollope wrote for 3 hours every morning before his day job at the post office, beginning at 5:30 a.m., producing 47 novels. Darwin walked the same path at the same time every afternoon, thinking. The routine was not a constraint on the work, it was the scaffold the work climbed. I'll admit something here that the productivity literature never quite acknowledges. Building this structure is deeply uncomfortable in the beginning, not because the schedule is hard to keep, but because protecting your most important hours requires disappointing people who are used to having immediate access to you. And disappointing people, even for the right reasons, activates the same social pain circuitry we discussed earlier. The architecture of your day will require you to say no to things that feel urgent, to people who feel entitled at moments when it would be easier to simply comply. This is the cost. It is worth it, but it should be named honestly. Chadha, Baumeister, and Tierney's decision fatigue research gives us the clearest possible instruction for temporal design. Your highest capacity hours are not a reward to be enjoyed after the administrative work is done. They are a resource to be protected before anything else has a chance to deplete them. Whatever requires your most sophisticated judgment, your deepest creative engagement, your fullest emotional presence, that work belongs at the beginning of your available day. Not because mornings are magical, but because resources are finite and sequence is determinative. The researcher Roy Baumeister found that judges reviewing parole applications approved roughly 65% of cases heard at the beginning of the day and after breaks, and roughly 0% of cases heard immediately before breaks, when cognitive resources were most depleted. These were professional judges making consequential decisions, and the quality of their judgment was primarily a function of when in the day they were asked to judge. If trained professionals doing high-stakes work are this susceptible to depletion effects, what does that suggest about the quality of attention you're bringing to your most important work when it receives what's left after everything else? The sequencing of your day is not a minor logistical detail. It is a statement about what you actually value, made not in words, but in the structure of your hours. Now, the philosopher Harry Frankfurt drew a distinction that is directly relevant here between first-order desires and second-order desires. A first-order desire is what you want in the moment, to check your phone, to avoid the difficult conversation, to do the easier task before the harder one. A second-order desire is what you want to want, the person you are trying to become, the values you are attempting to live by, the priorities you have identified as genuinely yours. Most people structure their days entirely around first-order desires, then wonder why their lives don't reflect their second-order ones. Pre-committed priority structures, which is what Seiton applied to time actually produces, are a mechanism for letting your second-order desires govern your first-order behavior. When you have decided in advance on a clear-headed morning that creative work happens from 7 to 9, regardless of what arrived in your inbox overnight, you are allowing the considered self to govern the reactive self. This is not rigidity. It is the operationalization of your actual values rather than your momentary impulses. Peter Gallwitzer's research on implementation intentions makes this concrete and measurable. An implementation intention is a simple when-then plan. When it is 7 a.m., then I open the manuscript, not the email. Studies consistently show that people who form specific implementation intentions are significantly more likely to follow through on intended behaviors, not because they have more willpower, but because they have removed the need for an in-the-moment decision. The decision was made in advance. When the trigger condition arrives, the behavior follows automatically, without requiring the depleted self to reevaluate, recommit, and re-choose. This is Seitan at its most functional, not the arrangement of objects, but the arrangement of decisions made in advance by the best version of you, so that the average version of you on an average day automatically does what the best version would choose. There is a subtlety here worth slowing down for. Designing the architecture of your day is not the same as filling every hour. The mistake most people make when they first encounter these ideas is to respond by attempting to optimize every moment, to construct a schedule so tightly packed with intentional activity that there is no room for anything unplanned. This produces not a well-designed day, but an anxious one where every deviation feels like failure, and the schedule itself becomes a source of stress rather than structure. Ma again. Purposeful emptiness. The architecture of a well-designed day includes margins, not because you expect to waste them, but because life reliably produces the unexpected, and a structure with no slack breaks under the first disruption. The margins are not wasted time. They are the buffer that protects everything else from collapsing when reality fails to conform to the plan, which it will regularly without apology. Design your day with enough structure that what matters most is protected, and enough ma that what's unexpected doesn't destroy what you've built. This is the balance point. It is different for every person and every life. But the principle holds. Structure serves you when it is architecture. It suffocates you when it is a cage. The difference is whether you built it or someone else did. One question worth sitting with as you move through the rest of this chapter entirely in your own mind without writing anything down. Think of the last week of your life, not as you intended it, as it actually was. Where did your best hours go? What received your freshest attention? What received the dregs? And does the answer to those questions reflect what you would choose if you were choosing consciously? The gap between those two answers is not a moral failing. It is an architectural problem, and architectural problems have architectural solutions. Chapter 6. The Practice of Shining. Say I so. Something happens to a space that is loved daily, not cleaned occasionally, not restored dramatically after it has been allowed to deteriorate past a comfortable threshold, but attended to, small gesture by small gesture, as a consistent expression of regard. The space begins to feel different, not just cleaner, different in quality. There is a word in Japanese craft tradition for this quality, teine, which translates inadequately as care or politeness, but means something closer to the attentiveness you bring to something you consider genuinely worthy of your full attention. A teine space is one that has been touched with that quality of attention so consistently that the attention itself becomes part of the space's character. Most people have never lived in a space like this. Most people live in spaces maintained at the threshold of functional tolerance, clean enough that it doesn't actively bother them, organized enough that they can find most things most of the time, attended to when the deterioration has become impossible to ignore. This is not maintenance. This is crisis management with a longer interval between crises. Say so, the third S, translated as shine, is the principle of daily attentive care, not the dramatic restoration, the consistent small gesture, the 5-minute end-of-day reset, the surface wiped before the grime has time to establish itself as permanent. The thing returned to its place before the habit of leaving it elsewhere has time to form. Say-so is, at its root, the understanding that everything deteriorates without attention. Everything. Your workspace, your body, your relationships, your clarity of thought. Entropy is not a metaphor borrowed from physics. It is the actual condition of every system left without deliberate maintenance. Things do not hold their form. They drift, and the drift is always in the same direction, towards disorder. The broken windows theory, developed by criminologists James Wilson and George Kelling in the 1980s, proposed that visible signs of disorder in a physical environment, a broken window left unrepaired, graffiti left unaddressed, signal that no one is watching, that standards are not enforced, that further disorder is permissible. The evidence for this theory as a crime prevention policy is contested, but as a description of internal psychology, it is remarkably accurate. Small signs of personal deterioration send exactly this signal to the self. Standards are slipping. No one is holding the line. Further deterioration is permissible. The coffee mug left on the wrong surface for 3 days. The email inbox allowed to reach 400 unread. The workout skipped for a week, then 2, then not thought about for a month. Each of these is not just a small failure of maintenance. Each is a signal to the self that this domain is unmonitored. And once the self receives that signal consistently, the effort required to restore order increases nonlinearly. Because now you are not just maintaining, you are recovering, which is a fundamentally different and more demanding task. You are not keeping a fire alive. You are relighting one in the rain. Antonio Damasio's somatic marker hypothesis offers a neurological explanation for why this matters beyond the merely practical. Damasio's research demonstrated that the body registers the emotional significance of environmental states before the conscious mind processes them, that the feeling of a disordered environment arrives as a physical signal, a mild but persistent somatic discomfort, before you have consciously noticed the disorder and labeled it as such. You walk into a cluttered room and your shoulders tighten slightly. You sit down at a disorganized desk and your focus disperses before you've opened a single document. You are not imagining this. Your body is reading the environment and transmitting its assessment through physical sensation faster than language. The inverse is also true, and this is the part worth holding. The body's response to a cared-for environment, one that has been maintained with consistent daily attention, is measurably different. Researchers at the Princeton Neuroscience Institute found that physical clutter in the visual field competes for neural resources, reducing the capacity for sustained attention. The cleared, maintained environment is not aesthetically pleasant. It is neurologically functional. It literally frees cognitive resources for the work that requires them. Say-so, then, is not housekeeping elevated to philosophy. It is the recognition that your external environment is in continuous conversation with your internal state, and that you are always, whether you know it or not, either investing in that conversation or neglecting it. The daily practice of say-so has a texture. It is not the 2-hour deep clean. It is the 5-minute reset at the end of each day. Everything returned to its designated place, surfaces wiped, the space restored to the condition you want to find it in tomorrow morning. The temporal logic here is important. You are not maintaining your space for the current you. You are maintaining it for the tomorrow, you who will wake up already carrying whatever the day ahead demands. The tomorrow you doesn't need to walk into disorder. The tomorrow you needs a clear surface, literally and otherwise, from which to begin. This reframe, maintaining your space as an act of consideration for your future self, tends to change the emotional quality of maintenance. It stops feeling like a chore imposed on the present self and starts feeling like a gift given to someone who will be grateful for it. because they will be. You will be. The morning you walk into a kitchen that was cleaned the night before, the desk cleared of yesterday's debris, the bag packed and ready. You know the particular quality of that morning. It has a different texture from its alternative. Not just practically easier, but somehow more possible. The day opens differently when it begins in order. There is a Zen Buddhist concept, Shoshin, or beginner's mind, that the practice of say-so, understood deeply, actually produces. Shunryu Suzuki, who brought Zen to the West, wrote that in the beginner's mind there are many possibilities, but in the expert's mind there are few. The expert has seen the thing so many times that they no longer truly see it. The beginner sees it freshly, completely, with full attention. Daily maintenance, done with genuine attentiveness rather than mechanical repetition, produces something like Shoshin. You are seeing your space, your tools, your environment freshly each time, noticing small changes, catching early deterioration, remaining in genuine contact with the physical reality of your life rather than operating from a mental model of it that was last updated months ago. This is where say-so extends beyond the physical, which is where it becomes genuinely interesting. Because the principle of daily attentive care applies with equal force to every domain that matters. To relationships, the small, consistent gestures of attention. A text that says, "I was thinking of you." A question asked and genuinely listened to. A moment of full presence given to someone who has learned to expect your partial presence. These are say-so applied to connection. John Gottman's decades of relationship research found that stable, satisfying relationships are not characterized by the absence of conflict or by occasional grand romantic gestures. They are characterized by a high ratio of small, positive interactions, what he calls bids for connection, made and responded to daily in the ordinary moments of ordinary days. Relationship maintenance is not a special occasion. It is a daily practice, or it is not happening at all. To the body, the workout done today, not dramatically, not heroically, not as the beginning of a new life transformation, just done today as it was done yesterday, as it will be done tomorrow. Not because any single workout changes anything measurable, because the consistency of daily attention is itself the thing that changes everything. The body is perhaps the most honest environment you maintain, in the sense that it keeps the most accurate record of your actual practices, rather than your intended ones. It does not respond to your aspirations. It responds to what you actually do, daily, accumulated over time. To the mind, the practice of daily reflection, not extensive, not elaborate, not requiring special conditions, but the 10-minute end-of-day honest accounting. What actually happened today? What did I do that reflected the person I'm trying to be? What did I do that didn't? What needs attention tomorrow that I'm tempted to carry into next week? This is say-so applied to the interior, the daily clearing of emotional and cognitive residue before it accumulates into the kind of weight that requires not maintenance, but excavation. The question say-so ultimately poses is not, how clean is your space? It is, what are you willing to tend to daily? Because what you tend to daily is what you actually value, regardless of what you tell yourself you value. The gap between stated values and daily practices is not a gap in intention. It is a gap in maintenance. And the good news, genuinely, is that daily maintenance requires far less than periodic restoration. 5 minutes of consistent attention costs less over a month than 2 hours of crisis cleaning after 6 weeks of neglect. The math always favors the daily practice. Always. The only reason people don't do it is that the cost of neglect is deferred, while the cost of maintenance is immediate. Pay it now. The daily payment is always smaller. Chapter 7. Attention as a moral act. We have been treating attention as a practical resource, something to be managed, allocated, protected from depletion. And it is all of those things. But there is a deeper claim to be made about attention, one that the efficiency literature never quite reaches because efficiency is the wrong frame for it. The deeper claim is this: the quality of attention you bring to your own life, to the people in it, to the work you do, and the space you inhabit, is not merely a productivity variable. It is an ethical one. Simone Weil, the French philosopher and mystic who died in 1943 at 34, having spent herself completely in the service of ideas she considered worth dying for, wrote something that has never been adequately absorbed by mainstream thought: that attention is the rarest and purest form of generosity. Not money, not time in the crude sense, not even love as it is commonly understood, but attention. Full, genuine, non-instrumental attention to what is actually in front of you. Weil argued that most of what passes for care in human interaction is not attention at all. It is projection, the imposition of our own frameworks, assumptions, and needs onto the person or situation in front of us, mistaken for genuine engagement because it feels like engagement from the inside. True attention, in Weil's sense, requires a kind of self-evacuation, the temporary suspension of your own agenda, your own interpretations, your own impatience to arrive at a conclusion, so that what is actually there can be perceived rather than constructed. This is extraordinarily difficult. It is, Weil thought, the central human moral challenge. And it begins, this is the part that gets missed, with the attention you bring to your own interior. You cannot give what you do not have. A person who has never learned to attend to their own experience with honesty and precision, who moves through their own life on autopilot, who has never genuinely examined what they feel, what they need, what they are actually doing and why, cannot suddenly produce genuine attention for another person. They will produce the performance of attention, which is something quite different, and which the recipient can almost always detect, even if they cannot name what's missing. Seiso, practiced as daily attentive care, is the training ground for this capacity. When you clean your space with genuine attention, not mechanically, not with your mind 3 steps ahead, you are practicing the act of full presence with something real and immediate. The surface under your hands, the state of the objects you're handling, the small signs of wear and use that tell you something about how this space has been lived in. This is not mysticism. This is the cultivation of a sensory and cognitive habit, the habit of actually perceiving what is in front of you rather than operating from assumption and habit. The reticular activating system, a network of neurons in the brainstem responsible for regulating arousal and directing attention, operates on a principle of trained salience. It filters the enormous volume of sensory information available at any moment and forwards to conscious awareness only what it has been trained to consider relevant. This filtering is mostly unconscious and mostly useful. You don't need to consciously register every sound and sensation in your environment to function. But the RAS can also be trained gradually and deliberately to notice things it previously filtered out. Early signs of deterioration in a space you're maintaining. The slight tension in someone's voice that signals they need something they haven't asked for. The moment in your own body when focus begins to drift before it has fully departed. This is the neurological basis of what contemplative traditions have always called mindfulness, stripped of the language that makes scientists uncomfortable. It is the training of the perceptual system to notice more, sooner, with greater accuracy. And the training ground is always the immediate, the particular, the specific, not abstract practice in a meditation cushion, but the actual texture of the actual life you're actually living, attended to with actual care. Here is where Seiso, as philosophy, intersects with something the Japanese craft tradition has understood for centuries and articulated in the concept of shokunin. A shokunin is a master craftsperson, a sushi chef, a carpenter, a gardener, but the word carries connotations that craftsperson doesn't. A shokunin has given themselves to their craft so completely that every act within it, no matter how small or routine, is performed with total commitment of attention. The sushi chef who has made the same cut 10,000 times makes it on the 10,000th occasion with the same quality of attention as the first, because the shokunin ethic holds that the act itself is always worthy of full presence, regardless of familiarity. This is the opposite of the way most people relate to maintenance tasks. Familiarity breeds not just contempt, but inattention. We stop seeing what we do every day. We stop tasting what we eat every morning. We stop hearing what our closest people are saying because we believe, wrongly, that familiarity means we already know. The shokunin ethic is the deliberate rejection of this assumption. The daily act of cleaning, of maintaining, of tending, performed with the same quality of presence that would be given to it on the first occasion, is not monotony. It is the sustained refusal to let familiarity become blindness. Whale and the shokunin tradition converge here on something important. Attention is not passive. It is not simply the absence of distraction. It is an active, effortful, directed quality of consciousness that must be intentionally applied and intentionally sustained. It is, in this sense, a form of labor, one of the most demanding forms, precisely because it produces nothing visible, nothing measurable, nothing you can point to at the end of the day as evidence of your work. The output of sustained attention is perception. And perception, while it produces nothing immediately, changes everything eventually, because you can only respond well to what you have actually seen. The moral dimension of this becomes clear when you apply it to the specific domain of care. Healthcare workers, caregivers, parents, teachers, anyone whose work requires sustained presence with another person's reality, face a particular occupational hazard that the psychological literature calls compassion fatigue, but which might be more accurately described as attention fatigue. The capacity for genuine attention is finite, like every other cognitive resource, and when it is depleted, by volume of demand, by inadequate maintenance, by the accumulated weight of unprocessed emotional experience, what replaces it is not cruelty, but something more insidious, procedural presence, the appearance of attention without its substance. Going through the motions of care while the actual quality of perception has gone dark. The daily practices of say-so, the small consistent gestures of maintenance applied to self, space, and relationship, are not peripheral to the capacity for genuine care. They are its infrastructure. A person who maintains their own interior with daily attentive honesty, who tends their relationships with consistent small gestures rather than occasional dramatic ones, who keeps their physical environment in a state that their body registers as safe and ordered, that person has more genuine attention available to give, not because they are morally superior, but because they have been maintaining the equipment. This is the argument, stated without softening, for why self-maintenance is not selfishness, not the familiar motivational version. Put on your own oxygen mask first, which is true but has been said so many times it no longer lands. The deeper argument, genuine attention to another person, is only possible from a self that is genuinely present, and genuine presence is only possible from a self that has been attending to itself. The caregiver who has not been cared for, not by others necessarily, but by themselves, through the daily practices of honest self-maintenance, cannot actually see the person in front of them. They can perform seeing. They can go through the protocols of care. But the real thing, the thing that the person being cared for can feel, and that changes what it means to be in their particular difficulty, that requires a quality of attention that exhausted, depleted, unmaintained people do not have available. There is a private and uncomfortable truth here that applies beyond caregiving. Most people treat the care of themselves as the last item on a list that is never fully completed. Self-maintenance is what happens if everything else gets done first, which means it almost never happens. And the result is not just personal deterioration, it is a progressive reduction in the quality of attention available to everything that person touches. The work gets done, technically, the relationships continue, structurally, but the quality of presence within them diminishes, gradually, in ways that are hard to see from inside and unmistakable from outside. Seiso asks something that sounds modest and is actually radical. Give your own life the quality of attention you would give to something you consider genuinely worth caring for. Not because you deserve it in some abstract self-help sense, because without it, you gradually lose the capacity to give that quality of attention to anything else. Attend to yourself, not as an indulgence, as a prerequisite. Chapter 8. The Maintenance of People. There is a particular silence that settles into a relationship that has been neglected, not the comfortable silence of two people who have nothing to prove to each other. That silence has warmth in it, a kind of settled ease. This other silence is different. It is the silence of two people who have been in proximity without genuine contact for long enough that they've stopped noticing the absence of contact. The relationship is technically present, but something at its center has gone quiet, the way a fire goes quiet, not in one dramatic extinction, but in the gradual reduction of fuel, ember by ember, until what remains produces no heat. Most relationship endings are not events. They are processes, slow, mostly invisible accumulations of small neglects, the conversation postponed and never rescheduled, the question asked and not really listened to, the bid for connection that went unanswered, not from cruelty, but from distraction, from the ordinary busyness of lives too full of everything except genuine presence for the people who matter most. John Gottman spent 4 decades observing couples with methodological rigor that produced findings uncomfortable in their precision. He could predict with over 90% accuracy which couples would divorce, not by analyzing their arguments or measuring compatibility, but by observing the ratio of positive to negative interactions in ordinary moments. Not their best moments, their Tuesdays. Whether a bid for connection, a joke, an observation, a touch, was met, missed, or turned away from. The accumulation of these unremarkable moments was more predictive of relationship health than any single dramatic event. What Gottman discovered is, at its core, a maintenance finding. Relationships don't sustain themselves on the strength of their origin, their chemistry, or their moments of peak intensity. They sustain themselves on the quality of daily attention, consistent small deposits into what he called the emotional bank account. Grand gestures matter less than most people assume. What actually builds structural integrity is something far less cinematic, the daily practice of noticing another person, treating their presence as something worth attending to, even on the days when you're tired and there's nothing particularly interesting happening between you. This is say-so applied to connection, daily maintenance, small consistent gestures. The relationship returned to good condition, not through occasional heroic effort, but through the unglamorous discipline of showing up attentively in ordinary moments. Bowlby's attachment research adds a dimension the maintenance framework alone doesn't capture. The secure base, the internalized sense of a reliable, available attachment figure, is not produced by the absence of difficulty in a relationship. It is produced by the consistency of responsiveness. An attachment figure who reliably notices, responds, and returns to repair after rupture creates security not through perfection, but through predictability. You become someone's secure base not by being extraordinary, but by being consistent, by doing the maintenance, by treating the relationship as something requiring daily tending rather than occasional rescue. Here is the paradox. The maintenance principle reveals the people who maintain themselves most rigorously are the most available to the people they love, not the least. This seems backwards. Surely the most devoted person gives the most of themselves. But devotion without maintenance is not sustainable generosity. It is the progressive depletion of a resource not being replenished, ending inevitably in a collapse that serves no one. The caregiver who gives everything and maintains nothing eventually has nothing left to give. The maintenance of self is not a withdrawal from relationship. It is the investment that makes sustained presence in relationship possible. Ainsworth's strange situation experiments confirm this across cultures. Children with consistently responsive caregivers, caregivers who were emotionally regulated themselves, were more independent, more resilient, more socially capable. Security produced by consistent attentive maintenance paradoxically produces not dependence, but freedom. The person who knows they are truly seen does not cling. They explore. They venture into difficulty knowing connection is available when they return. The practical texture of relational maintenance is worth describing concretely because it tends to dissolve into abstraction. It is not grand. It is the text sent not because there is news to share, but because you thought of someone and wanted them to know. The question asked and genuinely waited on. The return to a conversation that mattered, days later, to say, "I've been thinking about what you said." The repair after rupture, not elaborate apology, but prompt honest acknowledgement before the silence around it hardens into distance. These are small acts. They require almost no time individually. Accumulated across days and weeks and years, they are the difference between a relationship that is structurally present and one that is genuinely inhabited. Between two people who share a history and two people who actually know each other. Christakis and Fowler's social contagion research adds one more dimension. Emotional states and behaviors spread through social networks up to 3 degrees of separation. Your emotional state affects your close contacts, who affect theirs, who affect theirs. The maintenance of your own interior, your clarity, your genuine presence, your emotional equilibrium, is not a private matter. It radiates outward through the network of relationships, extending from you in ways you will never directly observe. This is not a reason for anxiety about your effect on others. It is an argument for taking the maintenance of your own interior seriously as a form of social responsibility. The work you do on yourself is never only for yourself. One thing worth sitting with quietly. Think of the relationship in your life most neglected recently. Not the most difficult. Difficulty is different from neglect. The one quietly receiving less than it deserves, drifting the way relationships drift when both people are busy and neither is attending. What would one small act of maintenance look like, offered today? Not a grand gesture, not a conversation about the neglect itself, just one small bid for genuine connection, made and meant. That act is say-so applied to love. It costs almost nothing, and it might be exactly what that relationship needs to remember what it is. Chapter 9. Standardize or Surrender. Seiketsu. Here is the problem with everything we have covered so far, stated without diplomacy. It will not last. Not because the principles are wrong, not because you lack commitment or intelligence or genuine desire for the life these practices make possible. It will not last because you are human, which means you are subject to motivation cycles, to depletion, to the ordinary variability of energy and attention across days and weeks and seasons. You will have the insight, feel the shift, implement the practice, and then life will apply pressure from a direction you didn't anticipate, and the practice will be the first thing to go. Because practices that depend on sustained conscious effort are always the first thing to go when the conscious mind is needed elsewhere. This is not a character flaw. It is the structural reality of how human behavior works, and any system that doesn't account for it is not a system. It is an aspiration dressed in systems clothing. Wendy Wood at the University of Southern California has spent her career studying habit formation, and her most deflating finding, deflating to anyone who believes in the power of motivation, is this: approximately 43% of daily behavior is habitual, performed in the same context, in the same way, without conscious deliberation. Not 43% of unimportant behavior. 43% of everything. The food choices, the stress responses, the patterns of relating to other people, nearly half of what constitutes your daily life is not chosen in the moment. It runs automatically, executed by systems formed through past repetition, operating below the threshold of conscious awareness. Sobering because it means willpower governs far less of daily life than anyone comfortable with their self-image wants to admit. Liberating because it means the target for lasting change is not motivation. It is the habit system. Get a behavior into the automatic, contextually triggered zone, and it runs without the ongoing cost of willpower, without vulnerability to motivational fluctuation, without the exhausting requirement to recommit every single day. Seketsu, standardize, is the principle that addresses this directly. Its operational question is simple and demanding. How do I make what I've built into the system, rather than the daily agenda? The neuroscience gives this question a precise answer. Habits are encoded through myelin sheathing, the gradual insulation of frequently used neural pathways with a substance that dramatically increases the speed and efficiency of signal transmission. A well-myelinated pathway fires faster, more cleanly, with less metabolic cost. This is why practice skills feel automatic, not because they require less brain activity, but because the activity occurs along optimized pathways that don't compete for conscious resources. Every time you perform a behavior in the same context, in the same sequence, you're laying another layer of insulation on the supporting neural pathway. The routine is not just logistics. It is infrastructure construction. You are literally building the brain structure that will eventually make the behavior effortless. This is why implementation without standardization always collapses. You can sort magnificently, organize brilliantly, maintain attentively, but if each practice requires a daily conscious decision to perform, they are all competing for the same depleted resource. Eventually, inevitably, they lose, not to laziness, to the structural reality of finite cognitive capacity meeting infinite daily demand. Richard Thaler and Cass Sunstein's work on choice architecture makes the design solution concrete. Choice architecture is the deliberate arrangement of the decision environment to make certain choices more likely, not through coercion, but through the honest acknowledgement that decisions are never made in a vacuum. They are always made within a context that makes some options more visible, more accessible, more frictionless than others. Once you acknowledge this, you face a choice. Allow your decision environment to be designed by accident, or design it yourself deliberately in service of your actual values. Applied personally, this means structuring your physical and temporal environment so that what you want to do becomes what is easiest to do. The workout clothes laid out the night before. The phone left in another room during deep work hours. The social media app deleted from the home screen, requiring 3 additional taps to access. A friction small enough to seem trivial, large enough in practice to reduce usage significantly. None of these are dramatic interventions. All of them work by changing the default. And defaults are extraordinarily powerful. People overwhelmingly choose the path of least resistance, not because they have considered it and found it best, but because choosing otherwise requires effort, and effort is in limited supply. Change the default. Change the behavior. Gallwitzer's implementation intentions operate on the same principle with even greater precision. A specific when-then plan. When I finish dinner, then I do the 10-minute reset. When I sit down at my desk, then I open the document before the email, transfers the executive function required for behavioral decisions from the moment of execution, when resources may be depleted, to the moment of planning, when resources are available. The decision is made once in advance by the best version of you. When the trigger condition arrives, the behavior follows automatically. No recommitment required, no motivation summoned, just a system executing. There is something worth admitting here that the productivity literature skips. Building these systems is uncomfortable not because the systems are complex, but because they require you to acknowledge honestly that you cannot reliably trust your in-the-moment self to make the choices your considered self endorses. This feels, initially, like a concession. It is actually the beginning of genuine self-knowledge. Wherever you find yourself making the same decision repeatedly, standardize it. Repeated decisions on the same question are a systems failure. Evidence that something which should have been resolved at the planning level is being resolved at the execution level at a much higher cognitive cost. The resource not spent on repeated low-stakes decisions is available for decisions that actually matter. The standardization of emotional maintenance practices deserves specific attention because it is the last domain people think to systematize and the one where the cost of non-standardization is highest. The therapy appointment made regular rather than sought in crisis. The difficult conversation addressed within a defined time frame rather than postponed indefinitely. These are not rigidities. They are the emotional equivalent of preventive maintenance. Interventions made before the system is in distress at a fraction of the cost of crisis response. What Seiketsu ultimately produces, when practiced fully, is a life that maintains itself. Not perfectly, not without occasional adjustment, but with dramatically less ongoing effort than a life maintained entirely through willpower. The systems do the work. You design the systems. The question to carry forward is not, how motivated am I to maintain what I've built? It is, how well have I designed my systems to function when motivation is absent? Because motivation will be absent, regularly, predictably, without apology. Build the real system, designed for your worst day, not your best. And watch what happens when the worst day arrives and the system holds anyway. Not because you were strong enough, but because you were smart enough in advance to build something that didn't require your strength. Chapter 10. Designing for Your Worst Self. There is a version of you that exists at 11 p.m. on a Thursday after a day that started badly and never quite recovered. This version has made somewhere between 200 and 220 decisions since waking. Researchers at various institutions have attempted to quantify daily decision-making, and the numbers vary, but they converge on the same conclusion. By evening, the decision-making apparatus is not functioning at the same level it was at 7 in the morning. This is not the version of you that should be trusted with important choices. This is not the version that should be asked to summon motivation, to resist temptation, to engage in sophisticated self-regulation. And yet, this is the version most personal development systems are implicitly designed for. Systems that require you to choose correctly in the moment, to feel motivated when the moment demands action, to override the exhausted default with virtuous intention. These systems are designed for the morning self and abandoned by the evening one. They fail not because the person using them lacks commitment, but because they were architected for a human being who doesn't exist, someone whose cognitive and emotional resources remain constant across the full duration of a day. Real design, the kind that actually produces lasting behavioral change, is designed for the worst version of the person who will use it, for the depleted Thursday evening self, for the grieving self, the overwhelmed self, the self that woke up on the wrong side of whatever is happening and has been running on fumes since before noon. This is not pessimism, it is engineering. Peter Gollwitzer's implementation intention research, which we've touched on, goes deeper than the simple when-then planning structure when you examine what it's actually doing at the level of cognitive processing. The reason implementation intentions work is that they transfer the executive function required for behavioral decisions from the moment of execution, when resources may be depleted, to the moment of planning, when resources are available. They pre-commit the depleted self to choices the resource self has already made. This is not self-coercion, it is self-respect. It is the acknowledgement that you deserve to have good systems in place for the version of you that is struggling, not just excellent intentions available for the version that isn't. The Stoics had a practice for this that predates the behavioral science by 2 millennia. Premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of adversity. The deliberate anticipation of what could go wrong, not to catastrophize, but to prepare. Seneca wrote, Omnia aliena sunt, tempus tantum nostrum. Everything is alien to us, only time is truly ours. But the practice he recommended was to spend time each day imagining the conditions under which what you valued most might be taken from you or compromised, not to cultivate anxiety, but to develop the response plans that would make you functional when those conditions arrived. The Stoic who has already imagined losing their health is not more fearful when illness comes. They are more prepared. The contingency has already been navigated mentally. The response is already partly formed. Applied to personal system design, premeditatio malorum asks, what are the specific conditions under which my practices are most likely to fail? Not in the abstract, not when I'm busy or when I'm stressed, but specifically. What time of day? What emotional state? What kind of preceding event? What does the environment look like when I abandon my commitments? Get specific. The specificity is where the design value lives. Because once you know exactly when and how your systems tend to fail, you can design for those specific failure points. Not by trying to prevent the difficult conditions. You cannot reliably prevent being exhausted or overwhelmed or emotionally derailed. But by ensuring that when those conditions arrive, the structure of your environment and your pre-committed responses make the right behavior easier than the wrong one, even for the version of you that has nothing left. B.J. Fogg's behavior model frames this as a friction question. Every behavior has a friction cost, the effort, both physical and cognitive, required to initiate and complete it. Desired behaviors with high friction fail under adversity. Undesired behaviors with low friction succeed under adversity. The design task is to reduce friction on desired behaviors and increase it on undesired ones, so that the path of least resistance, the path the depleted self will automatically take, leads somewhere you've already decided you want to go. This friction engineering is more powerful than it sounds, and the evidence for it comes from contexts far removed from personal productivity. A study at Google's New York office found that placing water more prominently than soda in the office kitchen, without removing the soda, without any instructions or incentives, reduced soda consumption by 30% over 7 weeks. No willpower required, no motivation summoned, just a change in the friction differential between two options. The behavior that required slightly less effort won consistently among educated professionals who were entirely capable of choosing otherwise. Now apply this to the behaviors that actually matter to you. The creative work you intend to do but consistently postpone. What would it take to make opening the project the lowest friction action available when you sit down at your desk? The exercise practice you commit to and regularly abandon. What would it take to make beginning the workout require less effort than not beginning it? The relationship maintenance you value but neglect? What would it take to make the small gesture of connection the path of least resistance rather than the extra step? These are not rhetorical questions. They are engineering problems with engineering solutions, and the solutions are almost always simpler than the psychological drama surrounding them suggests. Hal Hershfield's research on what he calls future self-continuity adds a dimension here that the friction framework alone doesn't capture. Hershfield found, using neuroimaging, that when people think about their future selves, the brain activates the same regions used when thinking about strangers, not the regions associated with self-referential thought. We are, neurologically, somewhat disconnected from the people we will be. This disconnection has measurable behavioral consequences. People with low future self-continuity, those who feel little psychological connection to the person they will be in 10 years, make systematically worse long-term decisions. They are more likely to sacrifice future well-being for present comfort, more likely to underinvest in their health and finances and relationships, more likely to treat the future self as someone else's problem. People with high future self-continuity, those who feel genuinely connected to who they will be, make better long-term decisions, not because they are more virtuous, but because the future self is experienced as genuinely theirs to protect. The investment doesn't feel like sacrifice. It feels like self-care directed at a different temporal address. The implication for system design is this. One of the most effective things you can do to improve your long-term behavioral consistency is to increase your felt connection to your future self. Not abstractly, specifically. The person who will wake up tomorrow in the environment you design today. The person who will inherit the habits you're building or failing to build this week. The person who will be, in 5 years, either grateful for the systems you put in place now or struggling with the consequences of the systems you didn't. That person is you, not a stranger, not a hypothetical beneficiary of your current virtue. You continued. The question of whether to design well for them is the same question as whether to take care of yourself, which you have, presumably, already decided you should. There is a specific design practice worth building into your standardization work that addresses both the friction problem and the future self problem simultaneously. It is the practice of the pre-committed reset protocol, a brief, specific sequence of actions you will take when a practice has been interrupted, not if, but when, because practices are always interrupted. Life always applies pressure. The person who has no predetermined response to interruption treats each lapse as a potential permanent abandonment, which means the lapse itself generates shame and avoidance that compound the original interruption. The person who has pre-committed to a specific reset sequence treats the lapse as a trigger for a known response, which moves them back into practice without the drama. The reset protocol is simple. It has 3 elements. First, a defined threshold. After how many missed days or instances does the reset protocol activate? Make it generous but specific. 2 days, 3 days, whatever fits your context. Second, a defined re-entry point. What is the first action, specifically, that constitutes returning to the practice? Not getting back on track, which is not an action. The specific first step. Third, a commitment to no retrospective accounting. The reset is a return to forward motion, not a renegotiation of the past. What was missed is not made up for. It is simply left behind. Forward only. This is, if you recognize it, the application of Siri to time, the releasing of the missed days as weight that serves no purpose in the present. You are not building a perfect record. You are building a durable practice. Those are different projects, and only one of them is actually possible. Design your systems for the self you are on your worst days, not because your worst days are who you are, but because they are part of who you are, an inevitable, recurring, fully human part. A system that cannot hold the worst version of you will eventually fail to hold any version of you because the worst version shows up regularly without advance notice, and it deserves to find a structure that was built with it in mind. Build that structure, not for the ideal you, for the actual you, the one who is tired sometimes, derailed sometimes, struggling sometimes, and who deserves on all of those days to find that the systems still hold, the environment still supports, the path of least resistance still leads somewhere worth going. That is what good design does. It holds you when you cannot hold yourself. You will wake up tomorrow. The alarm will sound, or the light will shift through the window, or some internal clock will pull you up from sleep before either. And in that first unguarded moment, before the day has made its demands, before the noise of everything you're carrying has resumed its volume, there will be a brief pause, a second or two of pure, unfiltered presence. What fills that pause is a choice you're making right now, through what you're building, not dramatically, not all at once. Through the small, repeated, unglamorous acts of someone who has decided not to be perfect, not to have arrived, but to keep returning, to sort again, to maintain again, to show up for the system when the system needs showing up for, and to let the system hold you when you cannot hold yourself. The 5 principles are not a destination, they are a direction, and direction, sustained long enough, becomes character. Character becomes identity. Identity becomes the life you actually live rather than the life you intend to live when conditions improve. Conditions will not improve first. You go first. Sort what you're carrying. Give what remains its proper place. Tend to it daily. Build structures that hold when you cannot. And become, gradually, irreversibly, someone who lives this way, not because they remember to, but because they have forgotten how to live any other way. That is the work. It was always the work. Begin again tomorrow.